Back in 2020, when the pandemic was still causing all kinds of chaos, I started driving for Uber to make ends meet. I was laid off from my retail job and needed quick income. The thing about rideshare gigs is you see all kinds of people, especially when you're working late nights like I was. There were awkward encounters, drunk passengers, weird conversations, but none of that compares to what happened one Friday night in October. It was a little after midnight, and I had just dropped someone off at a hotel near the outskirts of town. My app pinged almost immediately with a new request. The pickup location was about 6 minutes away, in front of a bowling alley that was part of a strip mall. Pretty standard stuff. The name on the ride said Derek. I accepted it and started heading over. The area was quiet when I arrived, just a few dim parking lot lights. No cars in sight, and the bowling alley looked closed. But there was a man standing alone under one of the lights, wearing a gray hoodie and jeans. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with his hands in his pockets, head down like he was looking at his shoes. As I pulled up, he looked at me, but didn't wave or move. I rolled down the window and said, "You Derek?" He nodded slowly, walked over, and got into the back seat behind me. I started the trip and asked him if the destination in the app was correct, an address about 20 minutes away in a residential neighborhood I'd never been to. He said, "Yeah, that's right," in a quiet, calm voice. I remember thinking he sounded a little off. Not drunk or high, just sort of flat, emotionless. But I didn't think too hard about it at the time. I started driving, and he didn't say anything for the next 5 or 6 minutes. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror now and then, and every time I looked, he was staring straight ahead. Not out the window or at his phone, just at the back of my head. I tried to break the silence by asking how his night was going. He paused, then said, "Just needed to get out of there." I asked, "Out of where?" He said, "Doesn't matter." So I didn't push it. We drove a while longer. About 15 minutes in, I realized we were getting closer to the destination, but the address was in a really isolated part of town. No streetlights, big yards, and lots of trees. As we approached the address, he suddenly leaned forward and said, "Actually, can you pull into that driveway right there?" He pointed to a house on the right. The house was dark, no lights on inside or out. It looked old and abandoned, honestly. It had an overgrown lawn and paint peeling on the siding. There was also no car in the driveway. I said, "Is this your place?" And he said, "Just pull in." I hesitated, but turned into the driveway. I stopped near the front of the house and put the car in park. He didn't get out. I looked back at him and said, "Everything all right?" He stared at the front door and said, "Wait here." Then he got out and started walking toward the house. He didn't go to the front door. He walked around the side of the building and disappeared from view. I sat there for maybe 2 minutes, trying to decide what to do. The ride was technically still going. I didn't want to drive off and get penalized, but I also felt like something wasn't right. My gut told me this guy wasn't just heading inside to grab something. Finally, I ended the trip manually. I marked it as complete and started to back out of the driveway, but before I could shift into reverse, I saw him walking back toward the car, fast. His hands were empty, and he had this strange look on his face, like he was angry or excited. I unlocked the doors because I didn't want to make it a confrontation, but something in me was screaming not to let him back in. He opened the rear door, got in, and said, "Take me to the other place." I asked, "What other place?" He said, "Just drive, I'll tell you." I said, "You need to put it in the app." He didn't answer. He just stared at me in the mirror. I said again, "I can't take you anywhere unless you put it in the app." He didn't say a word. After a few seconds, he told me to drive to where I picked him up. I didn't want to argue anymore, so I started heading back toward the strip mall. The whole way there, I felt this pressure in the car. He wasn't talking, but I could feel him watching me. The hairs on my arms were standing up. He was still staring at the back of my head. At one point, I tried to lighten the mood. I said, "Rough night?" He replied, "You could say that." I asked if everything's all right, and he said, "Not yet." I didn't ask any more questions. When we got back to the strip mall, I parked under the same light where I picked him up, but before I could say anything, he leaned forward and asked, "You ever wonder how you're gonna die?" I froze. I laughed awkwardly and said, "Not really something I think about." He didn't laugh. He just leaned back in his seat, and after a few seconds, he said, "I think about it all the time." Then he opened the door and got out without another word. He didn't close the door right away. He just stood there for a second, half in and half out of the car. Then he looked at me and said, "You picked the wrong guy up tonight." He shut the door and walked off into the darkness behind the bowling alley. I sat there for a minute, too shaken to move. Eventually, I drove home, constantly checking my mirrors. When I got home, I looked at the trip details again. Something was off. The name had changed. It no longer said Derek. It was blank. No name, no profile picture, no trip history. It was like the ride never happened. I contacted Uber support to report it, but they told me the trip data was unavailable. They said sometimes that happens if the app crashes or if the rider cancels midway. But I know what I saw. I know I completed the trip. I know the man got in and out of my car, and I know he said what he said. "You picked the wrong guy up tonight." I've never seen him again, and I hope I never do. But every time I get a ping in a dimly lit parking lot or have a silent passenger in the back seat, I remember that night. And I remember that feeling that something terrible could have happened. That maybe he changed his mind at the last second, or maybe he was never planning to do anything, just wanted to scare someone. But I still wonder what he meant, and if he ever found the right car. This happened in 2021, when I was driving for Uber full-time. I live in a city that gets a lot of tourists, especially in the summer, so rideshare gigs can be decent money if you're consistent. I worked mostly nights, partly because I'm a night owl, and partly because it's less traffic and better tips from drunk passengers coming back from bars. The night this happened, it was around 1:30 in the morning, a pretty normal Saturday night crowd. I had just dropped off a group of college kids who wouldn't stop yelling in the back of my car, so I was glad to get a request that looked quieter. The name said Chris, and the pickup location was a small side street just off downtown. The weird thing was, the pin was in kind of an odd area, not near any bars or apartments, more like near the back lot of an old strip mall. But I figured maybe it was just a bad GPS marker. It happens sometimes. I drove over and saw a guy standing at the corner, hoodie on, jeans, staring down at his phone. I pulled up and said, "Chris?" He nodded and got in the back without saying much. He didn't smell like alcohol or slur his words. He seemed sober and just really quiet. He didn't say hello, nor did he answer when I asked how his night was going. Some people just aren't talkers, so I didn't think much of it. I started the ride, and the drop-off was on the opposite side of town, 25 minutes away, in a suburban neighborhood I'd been to maybe once or twice before. The thing was, it was dark out there, like no streetlights in some areas. Pretty isolated. I noticed about 5 minutes into the trip that Chris had his phone out, but he wasn't texting or calling anyone. He was holding it flat in his lap with the flashlight on, just shining the beam upward, slightly toward my seat. I asked him kind of half joking, "Everything all right back there?" He just mumbled, "Yeah," and then turned the flashlight off. The next 20 minutes were dead silent, just the hum of the engine and a weird tension building in the car. I don't know how to describe it. Something just felt off about this guy. Not threatening, but definitely unsettled, like he wasn't really there. We got to the neighborhood, and I followed the GPS to the house. But as we pulled up, I noticed it was totally dark. No porch light, no inside lights, nothing. I asked, "Is this the right place?" Chris didn't answer. He just sat there. I turned around and looked at him. I repeated myself a little louder, saying, "Hey, is this it?" He stared past me out the window. I repeated myself one more time, and finally he nodded. So I put the car in park and said, "Have a good night." He didn't move. He just sat there. So I asked again, "Are you good?" He finally reached for the handle and stepped out, but he didn't close the door. He just stood outside the car with the door open, facing the house. I sat there waiting. A few seconds passed, then 20, and then a full minute. I was just about to say something when he suddenly turned around, looked at me through the open door and said, "I need to go back." I blinked and said, "Back where?" He said, "Where you picked me up." His tone was flat with no emotion. I didn't know what to say. That was a 25-minute drive, and it wasn't like I could just reverse the trip. I told him he'd have to request a new ride, but he just stared at me. He begged me, saying, "Please, I need to go back." I told him again, "You need to request it through the app." That's when he said something that sent chills up my spine. He said, "I can't. They're not gone yet." My only response could be, "Who's not gone?" He didn't answer. He just stood there, still holding the door open, and I noticed he was breathing heavily. At that point, I started getting seriously uncomfortable. I said, "Look, I can't just start a new ride unless you request it." He stared for another second, then slowly backed away and closed the door. He walked toward the house, even though it was pitch black and looked empty. I waited until he got to the porch before I pulled off. The moment I turned the corner, I ended the trip in the app and started heading back toward downtown. A couple blocks down, I stopped at a 24-hour gas station to use the bathroom and get a drink. I parked at the side of the building, went inside, and came back out maybe 4 minutes later. And when I got back to my car, I felt like my brain short-circuited. Chris was sitting in the back seat, same hoodie and same expression. I thought I had locked the doors before going inside, but somehow he was in the back of the car. I opened the driver's side door and stepped back in slowly, keeping my eye on him through the mirror. "How did you get back in?" I asked. He just said, "Take me back." I said, "I'm calling the cops," and reached for my phone. That's when he leaned forward, close enough for me to hear his breath, and said, "They're still in the house." I don't know why, but I didn't call the police. Something about the way he said that made me feel like he was having some kind of episode. I played along and said, "Whose house is that?" And he said, "My parents." I asked him if he lived there, and he said not anymore. That made the hairs stand up on my neck. I started slowly driving back to where I picked him up. Every part of me was screaming not to do it, but I didn't know what else to do. As we got closer, he started breathing heavier. He was rocking slightly in the back seat. At one point, he whispered, "They're still there. They won't leave, no matter what I do." When we pulled up to the house, there were still no lights, still no signs of anyone living there. He got out without saying anything and then walked up to the front door and stood there. He didn't knock or anything, he just stood still. I waited maybe 30 seconds, then pulled away again, making damn sure the doors were locked. I drove 3 blocks, parked under a streetlight, and sat there for 10 minutes trying to process what just happened. I debated calling the cops, but what would I even say? That a guy got into my car twice and said weird things? There was no crime technically as far as I knew, so I just drove home and didn't sleep that night. The next day, I reported the ride to Uber, and honestly, I regretted not reporting this to the police because the man might have been sick in the head needing help. I hope he didn't hurt anyone. Who knows if that house was even really his parents' house, or if he actually was just having a manic episode.